A young woman had just graduated from nursing school and started working at a new hospital. Although she loved her job as a nurse, she had difficulty getting along with the people she worked with. Most of them were young doctors who had just finished medical school. The problem was that they enjoyed playing pranks on each other. It was hard for her to live with them in the quarters next to the hospital because they made noise late into the night. The nurse worked long hours and needed her sleep. Whenever she complained about their behavior, the mischievous doctors just laughed in her face and told her to shut her fat mouth. Eventually, the nurse reported the doctor's behavior to the hospital manager, and they all got into various kinds of trouble. The doctors started to genuinely hate the nurse and spent days coming up with a plan to get back at her. Finally, one of the doctors devised a truly cruel prank, and the others eagerly agreed to help. One night, they sneaked into the morgue in the hospital's basement and sawed off a hand from one of the corpses. Then they crept into the nurse's room and placed the severed hand under her bed sheets. They positioned it at the foot of the bed so that her feet would touch it when she lay down. Chuckling, they stood in the hallway, waiting for the young nurse to come to bed. When she went to her room, the doctors had to stifle their laughter. The nurse was suspicious of their behavior but was too tired to investigate. She entered her room and closed the door behind her. The men in the hallway eagerly waited for the nurse to find the severed hand in her bed. But nothing happened. There were no screams or curses, everything was quiet. After a while, the doctors got bored of waiting and started going to bed. They assumed they had pushed the hand too far under the covers, and the nurse hadn't felt it. The next morning, when they woke up, the doctors went to check on the nurse. When she didn't answer their knocks, they turned the door handle and walked in. The room was completely empty. The doctors searched the nurse's bedroom, and when they opened her closet, they were met with a horrifying sight. The nurse was curled up in the corner of the closet. Her hair had turned completely white. Her eyes were rolled back as if she had gone mad. Her face had aged about 20 years, but the worst part was that she was chewing on the decaying hand. I hope my memory doesn't fail me. It's been about 4 years since this happened. I'll start with the obvious. You can believe it or just dismiss it. This story isn't made up, nor is it something I heard from someone else. To be honest, I still can't fully believe what I saw. The story begins when I started dating a girl. There weren't many feelings involved, it was just for fun. But that's not the point of the story. So we were hanging out, having fun, and one night, this girl stayed over at my place. I'll keep our names private, you can come up with your own reason. It was way past midnight, and after having a few drinks, we started getting intimate. But then something happened that I never expected. The lights were off, and when she came over and lay down next to me in the dim light, I couldn't see her face. But as she leaned in closer to my face, I was stunned. She had the same long smoky hair as always, but her face. No, it wasn't just her face. Her whole visage was inhuman, with black oily skin and wide but narrow eyes staring at me. Paralyzed with fear, I jumped out of bed and ran to the light switch. Flipping it on, I braced myself for the worst, expecting a gruesome death. But when I turned around, I saw her normal. You get it. And she looked a bit shocked too. I blamed it on a sudden headache and a nosebleed from the stress. We decided to just sleep. Of course, I didn't sleep a wink, and in the morning I blamed it on drinking too much. But from that night on, I was plagued by horrific nightmares, bloody chaos, screams, and cries of children. It's hard to describe what I saw in those dreams, but I'll return to that at the end of the story. A couple of days later, she invited me out. Our village didn't have many places to hang out. There was a small forest, the railway, and the cemetery, all close to each other. So, we decided to walk along the railway. I bought some beer, and after walking for a bit, we sat down and started talking. I sat with my back to the cemetery on one rail, and she sat on the other, facing me in the cemetery. We only had a little to drink, about half a liter each. I was about to suggest we go home, but when I looked up at her, she seemed scared. I asked her what was wrong, and pointing to the cemetery, she quietly said, "Look, there's a man standing there, watching us." My heart sank. I turned around. There was a man. About 5 meters away, tall, maybe over 2 meters, and thin. He wore a long black coat and a hat. Barely managing to say, "Who are you?" I started pulling the girl towards home. We began to walk away, and he just stood there, slightly swaying. It was quite a sight. We walked about 50 meters and stopped, stunned. The night was bright, the weather was good and warm, but where we had been sitting, there was a thick fog coming from the cemetery. When we got back home, we agreed not to tell anyone about this and never to speak of it again. We soon broke up, and this isn't a plea for sympathy. I was glad because that girl had had multiple abortions before we met, and when I found out, I quietly ended things. The nightmares that had haunted me every night also stopped. And to this day, I can't fully process what happened. But those horrors from my dreams are etched into my memory like a brand. That's the story, believe it or not. It's up to you. But I urge you, before getting close to someone, try to find out more about them beforehand, just in case. This story was told to me by the night watchman at our school. My friends and I went to the school to play soccer around 10 p.m. After playing for about an hour, I stepped out onto the school porch to smoke. That's when the watchman came out and shared this story. Here it is in his own words. In late '98, it was pretty tough for me to find a job. Then I found an ad in the newspaper that a morgue was looking for a night watchman. I called, got the details, and was told I could start the next day. So my first night on duty came. I arrived, got all the instructions, and while they were explaining things, a woman's body was brought in. I overheard that she had been in an accident and died at the scene due to severe blood loss. She had lost her legs. The place itself didn't scare me. I wasn't afraid of the dead. But after 11:59 p.m., I was sitting at a desk, drinking coffee and reading a newspaper, when the lights started flickering on and off. I thought someone was playing a prank, but then I remembered it was just me and the dead bodies. There was no one else. The lights finally stopped flickering, and I went back to reading my paper. Suddenly, the lights went out completely. I lowered the newspaper and saw a long, dark hallway in front of me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The body of that woman was standing 5 meters away from me. The lights suddenly flicked back on. My heart was pounding wildly. I looked at the body, and it slowly started to rise. That's when I felt a terror like never before. I stood there, staring at her, as she reached out her arms towards me. I quickly ran out of that place. I sat outside for about an hour, smoking cigarette after cigarette, too scared to go back inside. Finally, I decided to go back in. When I entered, the body was no longer on the couch. I called the head doctor and told him everything. He said he would come in the morning and ask me to explain everything in detail. Morning came, and the doctor arrived. I told him the whole story, but he didn't believe me. He looked at the couch and saw that the body was missing. He thought I was some kind of cannibal and fired me. I had to pay a hefty fine, and to this day, I remember that night with immense horror.